The red light on the dashboard glared a malevolent eye, confirming the inevitable empty again. David sighed a weary breath that mingled with the exhaust fumes of the busy Dandenong Road intersection. It was 6:45 a.m. and his tank, which had been nearly full just 2 days ago, was now bone dry. Another 20-minute detour to the servo he knew had the cheapest unleaded 91 in Cranbourne West. Another $5 he hadn't budgeted for this week. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore, it was a slow grinding erosion of his everyday life, forcing choices no working Australian family should have to make. David knew, looking around at the fewer cars on the road, at the slightly less frantic pace of the morning commute, that he wasn't alone in this quiet, desperate struggle against an invisible enemy, the relentless march of fuel prices. David Chen, a forklift operator at a warehousing and logistics company in Melbourne's outer southeast, had always prided himself on providing for his family. He and his wife Sarah, a part-time aged care worker, had built a comfortable if modest life in Clyde North. Their 2 kids, 8-year-old Chloe and 6-year-old Ethan, attended the local primary school, and weekends were usually spent at junior footy or visiting Sarah's parents in Geelong. Their biggest luxury was the annual holiday to the Sunshine Coast, a well-deserved break funded by careful saving and David's consistent overtime. They were the quintessential Australian family, working hard, playing by the rules and planning for a stable future. Life wasn't extravagant, but it was predictable, grounded in the rhythms of work, school and community. Their Holden Commodore, a reliable workhorse, was essential to this rhythm, ferrying David to work, Sarah to her shifts and the kids to their various activities. It wasn't just a car, it was their independence, their connection to their livelihoods and their wider world. But then a creeping change began to alter the landscape. Small increases at the Bowser became larger, more frequent jumps. David found himself checking fuel price apps multiple times a day, trying to time his fill-ups to catch a momentary dip. The casual shrugs at a few cents difference turned into genuine anxiety as the price per litre soared past $2, then $2.50, heading towards $3. The buffer in their weekly budget, once a comfortable margin, began to shrink, then disappear entirely. The incident that really brought it home for David wasn't a single dramatic event, but a slow, insidious erosion. It began subtly in late 2025. Australia, heavily reliant on global supply chains, started to feel the squeeze. International events far removed from the quiet streets of Clyde North rippled through the economy with devastating speed. Shipping costs soared, crude oil prices became volatile, and before anyone truly grasped the scale of the problem, the price of petrol at the local United service station on Balato Road hit $2.85 a litre for David, driving an older Commodore that needed 91 unleaded. A full tank around 60 litres was suddenly costing him upwards of $170. His weekly fuel bill, which had hovered around $80, now regularly breached $200. This was more than double what he'd paid just 18 months prior. He drove 45 kilometers each way to work 5 days a week. Sarah, for her part-time shifts at the aged care facility in Narre Warren, drove 20 kilometers, returned 3 days a week. The school runs the weekend activities, the simple trips to the supermarket in Cranbourne Park. Every kilometer now carried a crushing financial weight. David started cutting back immediately. He cancelled the family's Foxtel subscription. The kids' swimming lessons, a non-negotiable expense in a country surrounded by water, were put on hold. The annual Sunshine Coast trip, once a certainty, became a distant dream. The family started cycling to the local park instead of driving, and Sarah began taking the bus for some of her shifts adding an hour to her commute each way. They saw the news reports. Traffic on major Sydney thoroughfares like the M2 and M4 was down by 20% on weekends. And similar falls were being recorded on Melbourne's Monash Freeway and the Princes Highway. It wasn't just millions of Australians were making similar painful choices. The economic ripple effect was undeniable, but the legal implications, the question of whether anything could be done, remained largely unanswered for people like David. Who was responsible when the cost of simply existing became unsustainable? Was there a fair go to be had when global forces dictated your family's budget? David, like many Australians, initially felt powerless. He complained to Sarah, vented to his mates at the warehouse, but believed there was little legal recourse against such an amorphous problem. This wasn't a dodgy builder or an unfair dismissal, issues where the Fair Work Commission or VCAT might step in. This felt bigger, beyond the reach of individual legal battles. However, a colleague mentioned that the ACCC, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, was responsible for monitoring fuel prices and market behaviour. This sparked a flicker of hope. Surely, if companies were exploiting the crisis, the ACCC would act. David began researching. He learned that the ACCC monitors the Australian petroleum industry under Part 4 of the Competition and Consumer Act 2010. They look for price-fixing, cartel behaviour and unconscionable conduct. But David quickly realized the ACCC's powers, while significant, were focused on anti-competitive practices, not on global supply issues or the general rise in international oil prices. The ACCC could investigate if petrol stations in a particular suburb were colluding to keep prices artificially high, or if major oil companies were manipulating the market. They could, and often did, issue reports on pricing trends and the factors influencing them, providing transparency. But they couldn't cap prices or force a reduction in response to international market forces. David tried contacting Consumer Affairs Victoria, but they directed him back to the ACCC for market-wide concerns. Explaining their jurisdiction was more focused on individual consumer disputes and misleading conduct at a local level. It became clear that while the ACCC provided oversight, the current crisis, largely driven by global factors, fell outside their direct intervention powers to lower prices for consumers. The legal battle, if one could even call it that, wasn't against a specific entity violating the Australian consumer law or a clear breach of a contract. It was against the crushing weight of economics. Ultimately, there was no dramatic tribunal hearing, no court battle where David could confront the forces driving up fuel prices. The resolution wasn't a legal victory, but a forced adaptation. The family made permanent changes. David started carpooling with a neighbor who worked at the same industrial park, splitting the fuel costs but adding an extra half hour to his already long day. Sarah increased her bus usage, pushing her already busy schedule to its limits. The Holden Commodore, once a symbol of family freedom, became a tool used only when absolutely necessary, parked for days at a time. The savings from these drastic measures were real, but they came at a cost: less family time, more exhaustion, and a lingering sense of unfairness. The fair go they'd always believed in felt increasingly out of reach. There were no financial awards, no compensation for the erosion of their quality of life. The ACCC continued its monitoring, releasing reports that confirmed what Australians already knew. Petrol prices were high and market forces were largely to blame. While the transparency was appreciated, it offered little comfort to families like the Chens, who simply needed to afford the basic necessities of life. The crisis highlighted the limitations of Australian law when faced with global economic pressures, revealing that not every problem has a legal solution, and sometimes the only resolution is resilience and adaptation. This story, the quiet struggle of the Chen family, isn't unique. It's playing out in living rooms and on kitchen tables right across Australia, from the western suburbs of Sydney to the outer rings of Brisbane. From Perth's sprawling suburbs to the cold mornings of regional Victoria. What David's experience shows us is the intersection of everyday life and complex economic